Studies, the Institute for Women's Studies, for organizing this conference. I also want to express my appreciation to Professor Lourdes Habash, Abahir Sakka, and Lina Maari, with whom we worked very closely to review and finalize the call for papers for this conference, review the submissions, plan the program, and bring us all here today. This was truly a collaborative effort that I am so proud of, despite Zionist attacks against all of us. I also want to express my appreciation to my colleagues, first Dr. Robin Kelley, and members of this delegation who came at their own expense to Palestine, and this is not an easy thing to do. You will meet them as they speak here today, and others are not going to be able to speak here today, but they will be presenting at the other conference at Al-Najah National University on Thursday by the same topic. In the tradition of teaching Palestine, pedagogical practice, and in the visibility of justice, members of the delegation will engage in a full tour of Palestine. We should call it detour. In Hawaii, we call it detour. It's not a touristic solidarity. In order for us to meet, engage with, and listen to and hear from and co-learn with Palestinian communities throughout the West Bank and the 48 areas. We are unable to get to Gaza, unfortunately, as you understand. For the people who are here joining us from around the world, and especially from the United States, you realize that I always start my talks by saying we are convening on indigenous stolen people's lands. Today we are convening in Palestine, on indigenous Palestinian land, and we are very happy to do so today. To start us off, on March 14th, last week, right before we came, Campus Watch Middle East Forum, which is founded by Daniel Pipe, one of the leading Islamophobes in the United States as identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center, put out a tweet, and I quote, "Israeli forces just arrested a Hamas Islamic bloc student at Birzeit University, where SFSU Professor Rabab Abdulhadi is proudly holding a conference for suspected involvement in terror activities." On the same day, Campus Watch also tweeted, "Palestinian universities like Birzeit University are dominated by Islamist student groups that glorify and partake in terrorism against Israelis. Here's an example of, quote, innocent, end of quote, BZU University students holding a militant parade and yelling, 'Blow up the head of the settler.'" The day before, Campus Watch tweeted, SFSU Professor Abdulhadi Rabab, that's my Twitter account, organized a march conference at two West Bank universities that promote terrorism and hatred against Israel. These are the conferences that we organized in 2016 with the prisoner delegation here to Palestine. And we are supposed to have promoted terrorism and hatred against Israel and Jews. This followed several articles that targeted members of the 2016 US prisoner, academic, and labor solidarity delegation to Palestine. And specifically, many of them were published right when Oscar Lopez, the long-time Puerto Rican political prisoner, was released. And right then, Campus Watch released several articles targeting members of the delegation, saying that they were in the support of Oscar Lopez's struggle and the Puerto Rican struggle for independence. These continue part of all attacks against Palestinian universities in general, against Teaching Palestine, against Ahmed Studies, against me, and against General Union of Palestine students, and anyone who engages in scholarship, pedagogy, or advocacy on justice for in Palestine, and you will hear from my colleagues throughout the day about that. And this is not in divorce from the intensive campaign, the brunt of which we've been experiencing at San Francisco State, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and bring up the question of 68 in the process, because I don't have enough time, but I'm more than happy, and I would love to discuss that more. Historically and recently, we have been targeted. San Francisco State has been a place of strong, intense, relentless attacks against Palestinian, first really activism, student activism, and then since we started the Ahmed Studies program in 2007, against the program itself, and against me and against the faculty, to the point that the program gets reduced to one faculty member with no operating budget and no staff and no institutional support from the university. I don't want to talk about all the history because it's a very long history, and I can refer you to some places where you can receive that, find that history, and we can talk about it. But I wanted to just talk about the last 2 years, 2016, 2018, when the campaign has intensified. The campaign has intensified. In 2016, we started the academic year by Campus Watch attack against the Memorandum of Understanding we had with Al-Najah National University. This is by Daniel Paris, whom I mentioned, and the campaign specifically demanded that San Francisco State break the Memorandum of Understanding with Al-Najah National University under the claim that Al-Najah is a terrorist university, exactly the same way that they are labeling Birzeit, and basically they target Birzeit and Al-Najah all the time. And Truth Revolt, which is articles founded by Shapiro and Horowitz, actually called for my firing. In October of the same year, David Horowitz, Freedom Center, and the Canary Mission. David Horowitz is also a leading Islamophobe, identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Canary Mission, which is a shadowy organization whose Twitter account was even disabled by Twitter because they are propagating hate speech and lies. Basically, they put out posters all over our campus, 26 posters, and they put it on other campuses, 6 other campuses, denigrating us, labeling us as terrorists, as Jew hater. They called it Jew hater, hatred, and Jew hatred, to malign and smear and silence. All the organizations in the Israeli lobby industry, and I call them an industry because they are part of an industry. This is not cottage organizations that are grassroots. This is very much well funded by mega billionaires like Sheldon Adelson, Hayim Sabban, the Koch brothers, the Bradley Foundation, and these are actually right-wing who are trying to institute a neoliberal agenda in the United States by buying also centers at universities, funding chairs, funding research positions, visiting positions, and so on. San Francisco State, now we have Israeli Studies, which was funded as such, and we also have a whole line of $7 million of endowment for the Israeli studies. And there is also attempts by the donors, such as the Correct Foundation, for example, that gave $1.5 million to the university, and they took it back because the university, in their opinion, did not discipline Palestinian students sufficiently because of student protests, multinational, multi-ethnic, multiracial student protests against the racist mayor of occupied Jerusalem near Parka. So this was not sufficient, so they took back the money. And this continues. And this brings up the question that San Francisco State, which is a public university, which has a social justice mission, which prides itself in the spirit of '68, because in 1968, San Francisco State students led the longest student strike in the history of the United States. And it was led by the Black Student Union, which were members of the Black Panther Party, and the Third World Liberation Front, which was founded by multiple students from different backgrounds, supported by radical, white, and anti-Zionist Jews, and a big coalition. They demanded a decolonized curriculum. They demand decolonizing the curriculum. They demand a different kind of curriculum that teaches people about their lived experiences of their communities, validates it, and values it. Unlike the Eurocentric knowledge that comes out of the colonial experience, that only legitimizes colonialism and basically theorizes subjugation. So this was the spirit that happened in 1968, and this is the spirit of '68 that San Francisco State prides itself, and we're coming to the 50th anniversary of the 1968 strike. However, what is happening is that there is defunding of public universities, and rather than public universities going to the states and to the government saying, we really need to be funded, what is happening is that they're seeking private donors. So the relationship becomes, the accountability is no longer to the public, the accountability is to the private donors, the transparency disappears, and everything becomes cut in secret backroom deals that nobody knows about, nobody knows anything about, and that makes it also more possible for us to be policed, for us to be censored, for us to be silenced at these universities. Because now the universities are collaborating and partners with the private donors and the corporate world, and this will be discussed later on. So this was part of what was going on with the Israeli lobby industry. We also had continued attack through the spring 2017, which Salim will talk about the Know Your Right Fair. This is part of, he is one of the targets and is also one of the people who's researching it. And in May, we had another set of posters against Rasmiya Audel and against Students for Justice in Palestine and against Jewish Voice for Peace. In September, we had a third set of posters, and just as we were taking the plane to come here, there was another fourth set of posters that's posted all over San Francisco State that I haven't even had a chance to look at every single one of them, but the students sent us the pictures. But the biggest, the culminating was in June 19th, there was a lawsuit filed against the university, San Francisco State, California State University, number of administrators and staff, as well as me. And I'm the only faculty member, I'm the only Palestinian by a group called Lawfare. Lawfare identifies itself as the pro-Israeli arm in the legal community. Its executive director, Brooke Goldstein, said in a video that is available on YouTube through Electronic Intifada, that there are no Palestinians, that Islamophobia does not exist. And she said, and I quote, "The goal is to make the enemy pay and to send the message that protesting Israeli policies will result in massive punishment." Lawfare enlisted a law firm of 1,000 lawyers, pro bono at San Francisco, to support them in this. And the lawsuit itself is instructive in our Teaching Palestine project. What does it say? 77 pages of lies, I can discuss more details, of lies, misrepresentation, and smearing, 24 references that are cited on information and belief. It means there is no evidence, there is no proof, there is no citation. And in addition to everything else I've mentioned already, all the accusations, the past accusations that all been refuted, they are also accusing me of being the advisor to the General Union of Palestine Students and basically not fulfilling my responsibility of advising them what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And the good news is that twice on November 8th and also last week, the judge threw the case out of court and dismissed it and basically told the Zionist people who are filing the lawsuit that this is not unacceptable, and he dismissed it with leave to amend, allowing them to submit another appeal, but he said he's only doing it as a result of abundance of liberal thinking to give them a chance to bury themselves again, but that there is no basis for, and he actually specifically said, my anti-Zionism, support for Palestinian resistance and other things are not a basis for this. Oh my God, okay. What's the goal of these attacks? Specifically, the goal is to discredit anti-Zionism as a thought, as an activism and so on, and criticism of Israel equated with anti-Semitism. The attack is also to discredit the 68 decolonizing the curriculum project. And it basically puts the Israel lobby industry squarely in the colonial basket. In 2016, in 2013, for example, Tammy Benjamin, Rothman Benjamin, who's one of the founders of the Israel lobby industry groups, wrote a book chapter in which she targeted specifically the 68 strike and the decolonizing the curriculum, and she says anti-Semitism emerges from attempts in 1968 movements to decolonize the curriculum because it sets up something that's supposed to be separate because it challenges Eurocentric knowledge. And they built the case on it to get to the point of the Ahmed Studies program that we founded in 2007. They also intend to create enough noise and smearing to render the scholars who are involved radioactive. In two ways, teach a lesson, as I mentioned, but also to isolate and find their careers so people do not identify with them and other people stop doing it, and to dismantle the program. And specifically, structurally, to mark what was going on, to correlate, is these attacks escalated exactly at the time we were structurally building the program, we were institutionalizing the program. It was immediately as we were submitting the minor proposal. It was immediately at the same time we were submitting proposals for 22 courses to become general education courses, which means students in all the universities can take them. It was at the time we were building towards the memorandum of understanding with An-Najah National University. It was still in the works. It was at the time we were trying to start the Edward Said Scholarship. And they were trying to do it because they had already succeeded structurally to get the president of the university to cancel our searches and to delete 2 faculty lines, leaving 1 faculty member. And then they thought if they escalate the attack, they will be able to destroy the program altogether, because if you get rid of 1 faculty member, there is no program if things are not institutionalized. And there is no funding whatsoever. So what do we do as a result? And I actually was going to talk about, I will mention it and I'd like to discuss it, I'll talk about what we do later on. But I wanted to mention a couple of other things, that this is not isolated from the general attacks in general. So for example, the president of our university on February 23rd put out a statement welcoming Zionists to campus. This is the president of our university. And this is part of the stuff that I've talked about. I've responded in issuing a statement, but I wasn't the only person who responded. Our students immediately issued a statement. It wasn't only the General Union of Palestinian Students, Black Student Union, Students of African Diaspora, Black Student Business Association, Black Student Residence Hall put out a statement. A new group came out of campus called Jews Against Zionism. It was founded as a result to protest this. The Women and Gender Studies Department, like the Institute for Women's Studies at Birzeit University, that does not think that women's liberation is an essentialist, something that only concerns women, put out a very strong statement on its website against Zionism, contesting the president's statement. And Jewish Voice for Peace came out with a statement also challenging our president's statement. There is more statements coming out, and people are organizing more and more against it. Attempts are continuing to silence us, and I can give more details about that. But this is something that is happening, and every single time something like this is going on, there is a reaction to it. The other thing, that this is part of the Israeli attempts to escape, and this Dr. Abdul spoke about that, Dr. Habash spoke about that, Dr. Kelley spoke about that. Israeli attempts to escape the widespread support for justice in and for Palestine. The tide has moved, as one of my lawyers, Behnam, says all the time, pro bono lawyers. This is the amazing movement lawyers who are supporting us. The tide has turned. In the United States, there is a qualitative change today, in the sense, in several levels, but I will mention two that are really important. One is that Jewish students are contesting and challenging the claim by Zionist groups to speak in their name. Zionist groups can no longer claim to own Jewishness. They never did, from before the Balfour Declaration to the present. But they can no longer even claim that today, because more and more voices, students, scholars, people in the community are saying, you don't speak in my name. What Israel is doing is not speaking in my name, and we are refusing to do that. And if you recall 68, this was also what was happening during the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese were resisting, and there was a movement in the United States building and saying, this is not in my name. And Muhammad Ali was one of the main people who said, this is not in my name. And this is really important to keep in mind. The other question that is going, that there is widespread support in everywhere, that people are realizing that the question of justice for in Palestine is intricately and organically and dialectically linked to the question of justice for all. And it's very important that it's not set aside as an exceptional issue. What the Zionists are trying to do, and this is something that has been symbolized by the Israeli ambassador that last month gave a talk at Columbia University, sponsored by Students Supporting Israel. I'm finished now. Students Supporting Israel. He gave a talk, and he, by the way, lives in a settlement, gave a talk and raised several issues that show where the Zionist discourse is at. He tried to show that anti-Semitism is exceptional to other forms of racism and racial discrimination, which is something that people who advocate the indivisibility of justice reject, because it is part and parcel of other forms of discrimination and race. But he also said that the only answer to anti-Semitism is Israel. And he cites Charlottesville there, white supremacy at Charlottesville, to say that this is the reason why this is the case. We point out that Richard Spencer, one of the organizers of Charlottesville, called himself a white Zionist. He spoke to the Israeli public and said, I'm a white Zionist, and that is rightfully so. The Israeli ambassador to the United Nations also said that he said one thing that's actually very interesting. He said that when they ask you about Israeli apartheid, tell them about 1991. 1991 is when Israel basically kidnapped Ethiopian Jews and whisked them to Israel to have a very discriminatory treatment here, and that is something we can talk about, and we are actually going to meet members of that community as well. He didn't respond to the question of Israeli apartheid. He diverted it to say, Well, Israel kidnapped Ethiopian Jews, but he does not address the question of Israeli apartheid, colonialism, and occupation. And in this sense, it becomes really important as we teach Palestine to think about the linkages on settler colonialism that Robin spoke about. But I wanted to highlight that in terms of Palestinian discourses and Palestinian narratives, what do we think about that? And what does Teaching Palestine open up? What possibilities opens up? One of the aspects to think about that, pedagogically and intellectually and conceptually, is how do we think about settler colonialism as a comparative framework? And what does this mean when Palestinians advocate against Zionist settler colonialism, but at the same time buy into, or other people buy into, American settler colonialism? So for example, there have been times in 1988 when the Palestinian Declaration of Independence was issued to compare it with the US Declaration of Independence. And that is not only politically problematic and morally questionable, but it's also intellectually and conceptually inaccurate. So Zionism and the US Foundation are both nation states that are based on settler colonialism, or both on genocide, on either the genocide or the attempted genocide of indigenous population. And they should not be compared with each other. July 4th, 1776 should be compared with May 15th, 1948, not with the Palestinian Declaration of November 15th, 1988. As comparing things between the US and Palestine, we need to think about what are the areas in which comparative analysis can work, and how can we do comparative analysis, and how do we not conflate people's struggles in those in both those areas. And I'm going to actually skip as Robin did and go to the last. Yeah. So what does it mean if we're thinking about contesting all those narratives, and how this project was formed? This project was formed last year around the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration and other anniversaries that were happening in 2017, 2018. The 70th anniversary of Nakba is coming up, the 70th anniversary of Deir Yassin. Tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the Karama battle. So there is multiple anniversaries that come up that give us an opportunity to think about what do we do with these historical events, and how do we think about them in terms of teaching Palestine. One of the things that I think is really, really important when we were studying the Balfour Declaration, we were studying the 100th year of colonialism, is to think about 100 years of colonialism and 100 years of resistance as well. Because as I said, the Zionist narrative intends to tell events in the sense of subjugation, submission, and defeat. They never tell the story of Palestinian resistance or any anti-colonial resistance, because the goal is to convince the people who are resisting that their resistance is futile, number one, and to convince the rest of the world community that these people should not be supported, either because their struggle is unjust or because it is not a worthy project to support and to get into, because it's going to lose anyway. The second aspect of it is actually it allows us to think about the various diversities in Palestinian livelihood. So we're not thinking about one kind of Palestinianness. So in a sense, we're not saying pro-Palestinian. We are saying justice for and in Palestine. Justice for Palestine, for solidarity people, and justice in Palestine for the Palestinians who are engaging in the liberation struggle of Palestine. So even the wording, the formulation, the very terminology we use becomes really important in both teaching Palestine, co-learning about Palestine, and also in questioning what sort of notions we are advocating, both in terms of framing our knowledge and our thinking and our imaginings, as well as what sort of messages we are delivering and we're communicating to the public. The last thing I would say is that teaching Palestine then becomes a project, and the indivisibility of justice becomes a project to think that Palestine is not exceptional. Palestine, we don't have al-ras narration in Arabic, as people understand. Palestine is part of an ongoing struggle on the indivisibility of justice. That justice for Palestine should entail justice, advocating for justice in other places. It does not entail that people who are organizing around Palestine are organizing every other struggle in the world, because that's impossible to do. But it means that maintaining a broader concept of the indivisibility of justice allows us to think about how struggles for justice, anti-colonial struggles, struggles of workers' rights, struggles of on gender liberation, sexual liberation, workers, labor, racial, immigrant, what have you, all the struggles we're talking about, environmental, are always linked with each other. And this is where the right-wing agenda that is supporting Israel is actually failing. Because if you look at it, it's an agenda that's supporting all the parts of the agenda that are anti-workers, that are neoliberal, that support colonialism, that support oppression, that support exploitation, that wants to ban people from coming to, for instance, to the US and immigrating, that wants to maintain Israel and that supports the Trump agenda of declaring Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That was supported by the Zionist agenda and by Christian right-wing agenda, which is a very liberal, neoliberal right-wing agenda. To think about all of these things and connect them with each other allows us to think about how Palestine is part and parcel of the indivisibility of justice, and allows us to think about and actually end, and this is one of the problems that the Israeli ambassador talked about, that Israel is no longer a cause for quote-unquote progressive communities. Israel is no longer a cause for progressive communities. Israel is upheld and supported by right-wing, colonialist, exploitative, racist, xenophobic, racist and nasty right-wing agenda. And when we talk about that it is no longer possible, and this has been a very long time agenda, and we're talking about Palestine as the question of indivisibility of justice, it raises a question to us. What sort of a scholarship agenda can we maintain in order for us to teach, to advocate, to propagate justice for in Palestine and achieve justice in Palestine? Thank you.